Welcome. This is the Living Library Conversation. I think this is the fifth episode, and I'm here with Reverend Beth Eustis, who I'm sure some of you have seen already on our Exploring Integrity group. So, just a reminder: anybody who is interested in redeeming the hours for watching this, you can redeem them at the Karmic margin call Project Time Bank. So you earn hours, and for those hours that you earn, you can exchange them for a service that's returned back to you, and also start to participate in some of our new revenue sharing plans. But I'm here with Reverend Beth, and we have been talking a little bit about having the uncomfortable conversations. And what really emerged for me, Beth, in this conversation was that's really what a living library or a human library is about. The human library that came out of Denmark, the original intention behind it was to have those hard conversations with people who have been stigmatized. And hard questions are expected and they are appreciated. And what this is tying into for me, being in training as a minister and wanting to bring in more ministers and people who are on a spiritual path, bring them together and have the honest, uncomfortable conversations so that we can help each other out instead of staying isolated. You had said earlier in our conversation, Beth, how pastors are often isolated. So yeah, just my first question for you really is tell me more about that feeling of isolation. What has been your experience with that? And if you want to share a little bit more about what you just shared with me as well, tell me about how being in the religious or the spiritual journey, how that can feel very isolating.
Um, I try really hard not to be isolated. Um, but I've heard that pastors tend to go it alone.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not quite sure why, to be honest. But there seems to be a thing where pastors sort of go it alone. And there's also a myth that pastoring is a 24/7 job. Uh, I
Mhm.
told my congregation when I got there that that is a myth and I'm going to break it.
Mhm.
Meaning I take my time off, I take my vacations, you know.
Mhm.
My phone is on do not disturb at night, okay? I'm not taking phone calls in the middle of the night. I'm busy sleeping.
Mhm.
So, um, but I definitely know of pastors who are isolating themselves. They don't reach out to other pastors to talk about how things are going, what's happening in your ministry. So the young lady I just told you about who has this difficult problem,
Mhm.
she's a brand spanking new minister, and she reached out to me, and because we had been in a group together or whatever,
Mm.
and she wants to not do this in isolation and talk to other pastors and, well, how would you handle that? And what should I do? And, so yeah, I'm not quite sure why pastors feel like they have to go it alone.
Mhm.
But I've seen it and it's not a good look.
Yeah.
It's not healthy. Um, and what you're talking about building relationships amongst people at the time bank, and that pastors need to do that too.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I do make a point of reaching out to my fellow pastors and just like, hey, let's have coffee. I belong to what we call a community of practice in the
Mm.
United Church of Christ. We meet on Zoom.
Yep.
Um, and it's a lot of it is just sort of checking in with each other and how are we doing and stuff. And some of it is educational,
Mhm.
but still developing relationships with each other as pastors. Uh, so yeah, uh, it's really important to do that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'm trying to think. I can't even think why anybody would want to do this by themselves.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
difficult. Uh, but for whatever reason, it tends to be a job that is very isolating,
Mm.
and I think a lot of pastors feel really alone,
Yeah.
and they have to
Sure.
make an effort to reach out to their fellow pastors, to their colleagues.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I've had a couple of my pastor friends tell me some stories. They would just make your hair stand up. I mean,
I'm sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
and I don't know, they feel alone in it. Maybe they feel like they can't talk about it. I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, but I've learned from a couple of pastors from my home church what to do and what not to do.
Hmm.
And one of those was don't isolate yourself. So I
Yes.
make a big point of trying to stay in touch with other folks, and that's part of my job,
Yes.
uh,
Hmm.
is to develop community. And the other thing is to develop a community outside of your congregation,
Hmm.
because I cannot depend on my congregation for my emotional well-being.
Right. Yes. Hmm.
So I've started doing that too.
Hmm. Very good.
Like there's really a lot, and it fills up your time.
I'm sure. Yeah,
My time is
absolutely.
getting more and more full
Hmm.
all the time, which is great.
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
you had
I
said that, it's making you very happy. You've kind of been isolated kind of isolated in the home for about 25 years before doing what
well,
you're doing
sort of,
now.
yeah. I mean, I was raising my kids and I volunteered, and and I had friends and I did things, but I remember you told me you wanted to talk about like my ministry and stuff. And uh, at the time when my younger son was about to graduate from high school, this would be about 2015,
Hmm.
I started thinking, geez, what am I going to do when he graduates? My day-to-day life as a parent is going to be over. And I thought, well, you could volunteer more. And then I was like, is that all there is?
Mm, mm,
And I was like, it was sort of a not a great feeling.
hmm.
What am I going to do with myself? So then, in the summer of 2015, I found myself taking classes for a week one summer at Lancaster Theological Seminary. My pastor had been there and had done that series the year before, and he really got a kick out of it, and I just felt compelled to give it a shot.
Hmm.
Um, and I thought I was going to be sort of out of my league and everything, but as it turns out, uh, I had the best time. It was
Hmm.
so great. The worship services were so beautiful and meaningful, and the conversations we had were uh, just amazing. My classmates and the professors, I'm having so much fun. I started telling people that I was in Jesus camp.
That's great. Yeah. Mhm.
And by the end of the week, one of the women from admissions comes up to me and literally says, I hear you have a calling.
Mm.
And I was like, what? Who, me? No. Where'd you get that idea? Jeremy.
Mm.
Jeremy was my classmate.
Hmm.
He saw something in me and he must have texted her. And I heard this part later. He goes, she's coming here. She just doesn't know it yet.
Oh, wow.
I
Okay.
know, right?
Hmm.
So in the UCC, we talk about God is still speaking.
Hmm. Yep.
This was God speaking as loud as possible. I'm in the seminary. This
Hmm.
woman is going, I hear you have a calling. And this
Hmm.
dude who's only known me for 4 days saw something in me.
Wow. Mm.
I had to say yes. You
Hmm.
know, that was God's way of making me an offer I couldn't refuse. You know,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know. So I ended up starting at the seminary the next year, and it was a 4-year deal.
Hmm.
And I graduated in 2020.
Hmm.
Um, and that was the sort of the end of a long odyssey of growing up Catholic.
Hmm.
Uh, I got out when I was 13, and then I was pretty much unchurched for about
Yep.
25 years.
Hmm.
And then when my older son was old enough to go to school, I decided it was time to go back to church,
Hmm.
that I could not go back to the Catholic Church.
Right. Hmm.
Uh, they're both boys, and the sex abuse scandal was in the news a lot,
Hmm.
and I just could not. How can you take them to a church where you don't know if you can trust the priest?
Right. Right.
You know,
Yeah.
just couldn't do it. So, and after much hemming and hawing, I finally ended up in the United Church of Christ.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons I decided on it was because the then associate pastor came up to me before the service and she explained to me how it was going to go. And she introduced me to the Sunday school teacher and blah, blah, blah. And I felt welcome for
Hmm.
the first time ever in a
Hmm.
church. I said, this is it. This is my church. And I stayed for 20 years, the United Church of Christ at Valley Forge.
Hmm.
And we had two pastors in that time. The one had been there for 30 years total. I was there for the last 10 years. And then we got another pastor after that. And he
Hmm.
was there for about 8 years. So the two pastors couldn't have been more different.
Hmm. Yeah.
One was very, I'd say he's very old school, wanted to
Hmm.
do everything himself, had his hand in everything, micromanager kind of guy. And, nice man, a good preacher, but, and I learned a lot about the United Church of Christ. It's very
Hmm.
participatory kind
Hmm.
of denomination, which I really liked a lot. The congregation uh, votes on the budget. They hire and fire the pastor. They have a say in how the church is run.
Hmm.
I
Yep.
think that's really cool. So I really enjoyed that part, and they got me on the committees, and I'm in the choir and all that stuff. But what I didn't really realize until the second pastor showed up was that on the inside I didn't have anything going on.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
was empty
Wow.
inside.
Mm.
Emotionally, I was really having a hard time. I don't
Yes.
think I really realized how hard a time I was having. Um, but the other pastor talked more about spiritual practices
Hmm.
and taught me how to pray, how to
Hmm.
listen for the spirit, and how to act upon what you hear. And
Right.
it
Hmm.
takes practice.
Hmm.
This is something my congregation and I talk about every single week.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think it's something that a lot of churches don't talk
Hmm.
about actually talking and listening. People talk about talking to God,
Yep.
but they don't talk about the listening part. And they
Mm.
also, people are sort of under the impression that we are just supposed to pray to God for whatever it is we want, and we just expect God to give us what we want, as if, we put in the proper heavenly currency and God, the vending machine, will drop down the thing that we want. And it doesn't really work like that.
Mhm.
Um, I remember having a meeting with the Committee on Ministry in the Philadelphia Association to be approved for ordination.
Mhm.
And the one lady asked me, does prayer work? And I said, prayer works. But if your uh, relationship with God is dependent on getting everything you want from God, you're going to be very disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really more about us developing a relationship with God.
Excellent.
And that
Yes.
it takes
Yes.
time and practice and dedication, preferably daily.
Hmm.
Uh, and what I think a lot of folks are missing from the church that they don't realize, it isn't just about being good and moral and doing nice things for each other. I mean, yes, that's part of it, but the other part of it is this relationship with God
Hmm.
that is transforming and life changing and affirming. And this is what I really try to focus on with my congregation. But I can't make them do it.
Right.
I can
Hmm.
only encourage, and that's between them and God.
Hmm.
And everyone's relationship with God will look different,
Hmm.
and that's all right, you
Yes,
know.
it is.
But
Hmm.
it's been so transformative for me, and it's funny because I ran away from God for decades.
Hmm.
I had people talk to me about God. I felt God calling me to things, and I just sort of ran away from it. I didn't know what it meant.
Hmm.
Um, but finally, I like to say that when the second pastor came, at this point I'm almost 50 years old, and
Hmm.
I kind of think God was like, man, I want to get Beth on board, but I've tried everything and she's just not budging. So I feel like God sent in the big guns with this
Hmm.
particular pastor.
Yeah.
And uh he talked in a way that I felt like this person could understand me.
Hmm.
And I
Yes.
and he would talk about things that I had questions about. And the
Hmm.
very idea that he talked about listening for God when I felt like I'd heard God in my life, but I didn't know what to do with it, I thought maybe he'll understand me. And
Hmm.
that's how we started our conversation, which turned into regular conversations over a 7.5 year period.
That's
So
wonderful. Mm,
it was quite a conversation. And one of the first things he said to me early on in learning how to have this relationship with God was to, he said, ask God to reveal to you what you need to let go of.
mm,
That was
hmm.
probably the most important thing he said to me,
Yes.
because I had loads of things that I'd stuffed down,
Hmm.
tried to forget about, uh, that I blamed myself for. And I
Hmm.
felt like, well, I'm just going to have to live with this. I deserve it. My behavior was wrong. And I just thought I'm never going to get out of it. And then I realized, when so I went home and I did it and I asked God, what do you want me to let go of?
Mm,
And so many things
yeah.
flowed out. I don't even remember most of them now.
Hmm.
But one by one, I'd bring them to my pastor and he would, and I would tell him and he would give his perspective. And it's for, some of them, it took more than just that. It took more prayer, journaling, crying,
Hmm.
processing, therapy, a number of things. But
Yep.
still, though, that process brought so much healing and freedom to
Hmm.
me. And it was absolutely transforming. And it hasn't stopped. I mean,
Nope.
he said to me, the day you think it has stopped is the day you are in denial.
Yeah. Very true. It
know,
is very true. It's a
so
journey.
it's a journey.
Mm-hmm.
And but once you've been through something like that, you cannot help but want to tell others.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think this is part of the reason I'm a pastor. I want
Yes.
so much to tell my story and to share this with my congregation and to encourage them to give it a try,
Hmm.
you know? Um, and you're just sort of, I talk about the kingdom of God is like the best party ever.
Hmm.
But because that particular pastor used to say that, and I said to him, well, how come it doesn't feel like the best party ever?
Yeah.
And he said, well, not everybody accepts the invitation,
Yes. Mm. Hmm.
right? I think the kingdom of God won't be complete until everyone accepts the invitation.
Right. Right. And
And
I think that invitation looks differently for everybody too.
yeah,
And that's what being a unique expression, being a unique expression of God even is being able to understand what is that invitation for you. And
right,
yeah, yeah, for me, that invitation is bringing people who are on that spiritual path together and looking at how do we support each other towards better mental health. And with better mental health is comes economic development as well.
right.
What's coming up for me as you're describing your relationship, the dynamics between the two pastors that you've been in relationship with is that there are more strict, what we call tight churches, and then there are more loose, more open churches. And I think what I've been finding is what is that balance that the individual needs between structure and freedom. And
Hmm.
yeah, and I'd like to ask you, on your journey, especially recently, Beth, what has been your challenges as as a pastor, on your walk with God? What has been some of the challenges that you have experienced that you would like to share with others who are on this journey with you?
Oh, wow.
I'd like to reference something that you said earlier in this conversation
Oh,
before we
please
started this
do.
one. Was that and this has come up as well in my spiritual community as well, is how do we accept that people who are really struggling are loved and accepted by God? Like you made the example of you asked your congregation to raise their hand once you lost them, but you asked about Charles Manson being accepted into heaven. Neil Donald Walsh in Conversations of God said, even Hitler, made it to heaven. And if you can
Right.
understand that, you can understand God's love. So yeah, I'd love to hear that story again, as it's still fresh in my mind.
Uh, I'll tell you the story. I just told it to you, but I'm going to tell you again.
Yep.
Uh, I was a student minister and I was preaching for this congregation, and the theme was God is a loving God,
Mhm.
really.
Really?
And I told them that God would have accepted Charles Manson into heaven.
Hmm.
And I had a whole reason for this. I had a whole explanation, but this one gentleman, he told me his brain shut off
Hmm.
when I said that. And he came to me and he said, "Can we talk about your sermon?" And we had a really good talk about it. Uh, and he just said, "I just can't understand how God could accept Stalin and Pol Pot and Nixon and Johnson, these evil people." And uh, I said to him, I first of all, I told him the story about the vineyard owner who goes out at different points of the day and hires different workers.
Hmm.
And the end of the day, he says to his manager, "Okay, go ahead and pay everybody, but pay the ones who came last first and give them a denarius," which is what he promised the ones who got there at the beginning of the day.
Hmm.
And the denarius was the daily wage,
Hmm.
enough to feed your family for a day.
Hmm.
So he goes ahead and does this. Well, now, the folks who came in first are seeing what's happening and they're thinking they're going to get more,
Hmm.
but they don't. They get the denarius and they think it's not fair.
Right.
And so, and this is one of my favorite lines in the Bible. The vineyard owner says, "Can I not do what I choose with what belongs to me?
Hmm.
Or do you begrudge my generosity?"
Mm.
And so if you think that denarius, if you think of it as God's love,
Hmm.
no one gets shortchanged.
Right.
If you
Hmm.
got here an hour ago or you got here 12 hours ago, you still got God's love. If you
Absolutely.
just started going to church this week or you've been there for 50 years, you got God's love.
Hmm.
If you don't go to church at all, you've got God's love, you
Hmm.
know? And so I said to the guy, um, that, maybe, rather than worrying about these evil people, maybe we should just let God handle them.
Hmm.
And you and I be the best version of ourselves that we can be
Hmm.
and let
Yep.
God handle them. And God judges with mercy and compassion,
Hmm.
unlike us.
Yes. Hmm.
And I believe that's because I believe because God created us, God understands us in the deepest recesses of our heart. God knows everything about us
Hmm.
from the beginning of our lives until in the present time. And God knows how we got to be who we are and where we are now and why we've done what we've done. And God has compassion.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
truly believe that. I much prefer that over, what I've learned as a child about a wrathful,
Yeah.
mean God. I can't fathom that now.
Yes.
How can a loving God send someone into eternal conscious torment?
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
I just don't believe that anymore.
Yeah.
That whole heaven and hell thing. I used to believe that.
Hmm.
I used to believe that was a thing, but I don't anymore.
Yeah. And this is a pastor. Anyone watching this right now, this is a pastor
I am a
saying this. So
pastor.
tell me more. Tell me more about how you've kind of transcended that belief in heaven and hell. I would really love to hear more about that.
The reason I decided I don't believe in it anymore is I was told that, this is a man made concept.
Hmm.
The church uh, basically made up this whole thing. I learned this in seminary, and I don't know why I was so surprised, but I was.
Hmm.
At least 500 years ago, in the time of Martin Luther, uh, they had trouble getting people to come to church because people felt like, well, I'm a pretty good person. I don't need to come to church, whatever. And so they made up this lie that, every little sin you've got can send you to hell, right? You really
Hmm.
should come to church. They basically scared people into coming to church.
Hmm.
And it
Yep.
worked for hundreds of years.
Yep.
I was
Yep.
dumbfounded. I believe it, but I was dumbfounded. And so this whole idea of heaven and hell and purgatory and limbo and all of that,
Mm.
it's nonsense.
Yes.
Um, and because Jesus in their time, Jewish folks, like I said, I don't know what Jewish folks believe about this now. I don't know well enough about Judaism to say, but back then they believed that the soul and the body could not be separated.
Mm-hmm.
So the soul is not going to leave the body when you die, because in part, the breath, when when you die, you're done breathing. You don't breathe anymore. And the word in Hebrew for breath is ruach, and ruach also means spirit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, you figure if the two go together, then when you stop breathing, there goes your spirit.
Yes. Yes.
So for them, there is no soul rising up to heaven kind of thing.
Right. Yeah,
That
that
was
concept didn't, yeah, exist
that was
then.
not a concept. They had a concept of the afterlife, that it was a place where everybody went, waiting for the day of resurrection, uh, also known as the rapture, that kind of thing. Which is that's another story altogether
Yeah. Yeah, it
that I'm
is.
not
Mm-hmm.
so sure about.
Mm-hmm.
But so they had some idea of an afterlife, but it was not what we know now as
Yes.
heaven and hell. They don't know it. So
Mm-hmm.
I believe there is something.
Mm-hmm.
There have been too many near-death experiences to believe that we just fade to black when we're
Yeah.
done. But but the thing is, nobody really knows until you get there. It's just common sense. And yet, so many people over the centuries have tried to predict what happens when you die.
Yep. Yep.
But nobody knows until you get there.
That's
I don't
right.
understand why this is so hard for me. Such a
Yeah.
hard concept, but
Yeah,
it
and
is.
everybody's
People don't
experience
believe
with it
it.
might even be different too. So even if there is,
I
even if there
believe
is a
that.
near, hmm
I read two different books. Heaven is for Real, which was made into a movie about a little boy who told his dad he went to heaven.
hmm
And his dad wrote a book about it, and it was very, very detailed for a 4-year-old boy. The things he saw, the people he saw, and things like that. And then I read another book called Proof of Heaven. I forget who it was written by, but it was a guy who's a neurosurgeon.
hmm
Probably, some scientists, separate faith and science, and this guy was kind of like that. But he had a similar experience, but his experience was very, very different from this child.
hmm Yeah.
So who knows what it's going to be like? I
Yeah.
don't think it's going to be bad.
hmm
Uh, God being a loving God and everything, I don't think it's going to be bad, but who knows?
Right.
Nobody knows,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know.
and I think free will and conditioning has a lot to do with that as well too. Like you had said, they created this concept of heaven and hell 500 years ago. I just watched, it was a couple of weeks ago, I watched this film that was made in the 70s by a Southern Baptist church. And what they basically did was they made a B grade horror movie about hell. And
Oh boy.
they really kind of cast these people, these people who were like hippies and people who were kind of you know very caricatures of like hippies, liberal type of people who just they really portrayed them as very stupid, and that any belief outside of that conservative Baptist belief, they just looked like idiots. And it was like if there wasn't a hell, it almost needed that kind of of a ideology to create a hell.
Hmm. Oh yeah.
And yeah, so it's kind of like wow, it's almost like I feel like that branch of Christianity, or that branch of religion, you know, may be responsible for creating a hell, because maybe hell is in the mind and thinking of all the fears that haven't been faced, or all the fears that have not been properly integrated. So
Right.
yeah, yeah.
I
I
think
think
I think humans all have the ability to be heaven or be hell. You
yes.
know, good and evil, I think, resides in all people,
hmm
some more than others,
Yep. hmm
for one way or the other.
Yep.
Um, I think that's kind of where it comes from. And I struggle with it a little bit, because I mean, I believe that God is a being, a force,
hmm
that is a force for good, and that God is everywhere. God's in the air, God's in us,
hmm
that kind of thing. God is in all of nature and all of creation. But what I don't believe, but there's always like an opposite,
Yep.
night and day, black and white, that kind of thing. there should be some sort of an opposite.
Yeah.
But I just don't believe in a being that's like God, except evil, that
Hmm.
people can believe in.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's devil worship in that. I know that's a thing, but
Hmm.
I just I find it hard to believe that these two forces would be fighting each other for airspace.
Right.
Uh,
Mhm.
I just don't buy it. I think the evil comes from humans.
Yeah. Hmm.
Uh, and yeah,
Hmm.
but that God is ultimately good and loving.
Hmm.
But humans in the gift, quote unquote, sometimes it's a gift, a free will,
Yep.
uh, you know, they don't always treat people the way they should,
Right.
and hurt people tend to hurt people.
Yep.
So unfortunately, it can be a never-ending cycle
Yeah.
of hurt and pain and trauma.
Yeah.
But Jesus came to show us a different way.
Right.
And it's
Hmm.
pretty much the exact opposite way of the way we're living.
Hmm. Yeah.
uh, and so this is what we're talking about, and it really feels like an uphill battle
Hmm. Yeah.
to create justice and love and grace, and to treat each other with comfort and strength and peace. Uh, it feels like we're just, being a pushover or a doormat, but it's
Hmm.
actually, you have to be really strong
Absolutely. Oh yeah.
to treat people that way
Yeah.
instead of getting back at people who hurt you.
Yeah.
That's the easy way out,
Yeah. It is. It
you
is.
know.
Hurting people is easy. Healing people, is where growth, I think, is at, where the real the challenge is at.
Absolutely. It is. It's very challenging. It's very challenging because I say to my folks, uh, to let go of what doesn't belong, you have to look at it first.
Hmm.
Oh, who
Oh
wants to do
yes.
that?
That's
It's
the greatest challenge I face, Beth, in with people. And I struggle, and I'm getting better at this. Instead of being blunt and hitting people over the head with it, is just holding space to let them come to it in their own time when they're ready to face it.
right,
Mhm.
right. Yeah. So that's where I'm at with that.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. What comes up for me also with this concept of good and evil as well too is that to me, and this is from being exposed to materials like A Course of Miracles, A Course of Love, is that God is pure love. Love is all there is, and everything else is an illusion. It's the illusion, where we can create, where we think like the whole satanic type of philosophy comes from trying to compete with and be better than God. But how can you be better than God when you already are the essence of love? So to try to be more than that is to just create an illusion, and eventually the illusion gets shattered.
Right.
So yeah, so that's like with with some of these deeply evil practices where they hurt people, especially when they're hurting children. What they believe is that by hurting children, they have a victory over God,
Hmm.
which is completely egoic.
Right.
And we try to create these illusions of being better than something that already is everything. And
Right.
that's
Right.
but that's what it is. It's an illusion, and eventually truth comes through. It's inevitable. Truth, you can't run from truth. You
Right.
truth is there.
Well,
Mm.
part of the problem with humanity is not only do we try to be better than God, we feel we have to be better than each other.
Yes. Hmm.
You know, uh, what I try to, tell people is that, people of color and the gay community and women and children and the elderly and anyone who is marginalized, we're all together. We're
Yes.
all interconnected. And when Jesus says the first shall be last and the last shall be first, that's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
We need to include those folks so that
Yes.
they are well cared for and healed and have everything they need. and some people call that socialism and moan and groan, but I believe everyone should have the right to have everything they need. They should have proper shelter, proper food, proper clothing, proper health care, proper schooling. I don't see what's so hard about that, but there's this hierarchy where, white people feel like they have to be better than Black people, and men feel like they have to be better than women, and things like that. And that is not what Jesus is talking about.
Right.
Jesus didn't think like that.
Yeah.
So, but we need, as humans, we need to be better than other people. So, yeah, I don't know how you get out of that.
Yeah, that gets into something that I'm very interested in looking at, especially within the ministry as well, is that form of tribalism, where stage 5, the final tribe, the final stage of tribalism is that, we come together as a group not to compete with other groups, but because we see that every single person does have a piece of the puzzle. We just have to make the commitment to find what that piece is. And what we're struggling with, especially with psychologically, spiritually, our relationship, with the unknown, our relationship with God. You come back down one stage. Stage 4 is a group identity where you're competing with other tribes to prove your superiority. That's where racism comes in, sexism comes in, ageism comes in. Step down is more egoic. Stage 3, which aggrandizes the ego, the person, where somebody thinks that they have the right to rule or to manage, as a person, others. So they're competing with other people. Then stage 2 and stage 1 are more about being afraid of just being afraid and being a part of a group just for protection, or being one that is doing the punishing because they believe in like the Darwinism, or the strong, the strong will survive, and that kind of
survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest. Yeah. So as our human species is evolving, we're evolving emotionally, culturally, socially into seeing that we're all part of an intricate whole, and that we all have a place, even if there are people that we judge as not being as evolved or being as not as advanced as we are. They still serve a purpose, especially when they're challenging us to grow, because there's people that I get angry with, there's people that I get frustrated with, but
absolutely,
they're challenging my growth, let me tell you.
Oh, I feel you, honey. I feel you.
So, but yeah, that's something that I'm very, very interested in, especially bringing people who are walking this path together, and just see what do we have in common, what are the common struggles. And yeah, I think when we first started this conversation about isolating, knowing that we don't have to isolate, and that there are ways that we can reach out to others, and communicate in different ways too. So in our Exploring Integrity group, we're really trying to focus more on appreciation and curiosity, which kind of opens up the brain a little bit more and helps us to be less in fear and desire, which is where a lot I think our culture really is between fear and desire, safety and desire. But being able to ask intelligent questions, being able to really appreciate, to feel God's love, is really what opens us up to others.
Exactly.
Feeling in the moment. So Beth, we've been recording for about 45 minutes.
Holy cow, really?
Anything that is, yeah, it goes by very fast. What I say, when we're spending time in Kairos time, which is living time, honoring cycles, where we hold space and listen. We're in Kairos time, so things go by faster. Chronos time, named after the Saturn, or the kind of like the taskmaster, where they're managing like the minute to the second, where time seems to dilate and seems like it's longer, because the feelings are a little bit more oppressive. But this has been Kairos time.
Indeed. Time
just,
flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, they call it God's time. Yeah. So
That's
as
right.
we're winding down, is there anything emergent that you would like to leave this conversation with, leave whoever might be watching about your journey, just about God or spirit in general? How would you like? What kind of conversations would you like to have? What kind of experiences would you like more of moving forward?
Um, I guess to wrap it up, I would just say, if I can do it, anybody can.
Hmm.
Uh, it took a very long time for me. I resisted mightily.
Hmm.
I resisted God with every fiber of my being for
Hmm.
decades, but there is something in it for everybody.
Hmm.
I used to think there was nothing in church for me,
Hmm.
except maybe like community. I had friends. I was happy about that, but there's a lot more than that. You
Yeah.
can be filled on the inside
Hmm.
if you let God into your life. And it took a lot of doing for that to work for me. But if anybody wants to talk about that, if anybody has questions uh, or comments, or maybe feels a pull in God's direction and doesn't know what to do, I would love, that's the kind of thing I would like to talk about.
Hmm.
Um, Helping other people to have this relationship with God and then be able to follow in the way of Christ and then tell other people about it. It's
Yeah.
like, do you remember the commercial when we were kids, the shampoo commercial?
Mhm.
And she told two friends, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
how
Lori
Jesus'
reintroduced me
ministry
that
was.
commercial recently. Yeah.
Yeah, that you're too young for that commercial.
No, well, I was a kid when it came out, but I do
Yeah, so
remember
was
it.
I. Yeah. Uh, but anyway, that's how Jesus's ministry worked.
Hmm.
He told all those people, and then they told people, and it's still going on.
Yeah.
And there's really something to that.
Yeah.
Um, so I'd like to help people to get to know God in that way that fills their heart and soul,
Hmm.
and not just just being on the outside, being an out on the outside kind of Christian, but being an inside Christian,
Yeah.
uh,
Mhm.
and filling people's souls, uh, and helping them to follow in that way, and then share it with everybody.
Yeah.
That's my call, and that's what I'm living to do, and it's the best.
Yeah. That's
I love
great.
my work. So
What comes up for me in all of that as well too is like one of the first things that you and I were discussing at the beginning of this was this observation that the church is dying. I think the church is going through a change, going through a regeneration process. And
yeah,
that, like that commercial, tell two people to tell two people, that's cellular regeneration, that's cellular mitosis. So
right,
I really feel like our relationship with the divine, with God, with Source, whatever placeholder name you want to put on it, it's going through a regenerative process now, and it looks
right,
like it's dying, but it's the regeneration
right.
that's that's really
This happens about every 500 years.
yeah.
We're about at that point now. Um, so to me, I think some parts of church have to die.
Hmm.
There are parts of the church that have failed their people, and
Yeah.
those parts of church have to die. But I don't think the whole church is going to die, not at all. Um, I believe there's going to be a new market for church because the
Hmm.
world has changed so much since we were kids.
Hmm.
It used to be on Sundays, church was the only thing around.
Yeah.
We had blue laws. Nothing was open. Nobody worked. So everybody went to church. It's not like that now. And
Hmm.
for about 5,000 other reasons, everything has changed.
Hmm.
You know, um, oh man, I hope I didn't just lose my point.
No, let's keep going. Mhm.
Man. Um, so anyway, oh yeah. So I think there's a new market for church. I mean, there's always the folks who need community and the folks who are just plain in a bad way and need support. They'll always be a part of the market for church. But for me, the other market for church now isn't so much families with young children, which a lot of churches think that's the panacea. And it's not that they're not welcome or anything like that. Of course they are, but it isn't like people are spending generation after generation after generation in the same church anymore.
Right.
When kids get out of high school, they go off to college and they don't tend to come back.
Mhm.
So they're not really the panacea that everybody thinks they are.
Right.
They're just
Mhm.
not.
Mhm.
But there is alive today a desire for inclusion and a
Mhm.
desire to do something with social justice.
Yes.
And for me, I think a lot of people are more interested in that, and they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves.
Yes.
In which
Absolutely.
case, the church can still thrive and be alive. Uh,
Mhm.
in that kind, I think in that kind of setting. Now, of course, there's churches that are much more conservative, and some of those are doing well. There,
Mhm.
they are. Okie
Mhm.
doke. But for me, Jesus's message is more inclusive and
Yes.
welcomes everyone. And to me, that's the ultimate goal.
Mhm.
Uh, is to be like Jesus and to be able to say we welcome everyone and to truly
Mhm.
mean it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to piggyback on that as well, with this theme of inclusion and with social justice, I think what I'm seeing, especially with the younger generation, is that they still have an appreciation for the elements of story.
Hmm.
You look at the stories, that are the science fiction and the historical dramas as well too. There's these elements of the story that people are still resonating with, which is still part of that monomythical journey, still the Christ journey and the Buddha's journey and Muhammad's journey. There's elements of that, and I'm inspired by seeing books written about how you can take like a story like Harry Potter and find the elements that are directly related to Christ's life, to Christ's journey as well.
Hmm.
So the clues are there, and it might just be a matter of having more inclusive environments, where we can compare, what is it about the story that resonates with us, and then link it back to the religious and the spiritual themes that have always been present throughout throughout our history, throughout our species. So that's
Oh yeah.
exciting to me. Yeah.
Actually, storytelling is a big part of what I do.
Mhm.
I almost always tell at least one story in a sermon to try to connect it with the scripture so that
Mhm.
people can see how this resonates with us today. How is this still living in us?
Mhm.
And I feel like that's way more fun than just talking about what the scripture means, although I do that.
Mhm.
Um, but I like to hear personal stories.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people like to hear that just makes people perk up a little and pay attention. And it's relatable.
Yep.
It's just more relatable. So part of what I do is I try to make the Bible relatable.
Great. So what's the first story you can think of that you want to share, and we'll end on that note.
The first Bible story?
Tell me a story.
Oh gosh. Uh, um, okay. Uh, I'm preaching this Sunday on Psalm 22, the
Okay.
end of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 starts off, and Jesus is quoted in Mark and Matthew on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Mm. Mhm.
But the end of Psalm 22 is it's ending in praise of God.
Mhm.
And I talk about why that is and how could that be. And I talk about this woman is a friend of mine and how what her ministry was and how we praised we how do you praise the bad things in life? How do you praise death?
Yep.
Um, and here's Jesus on the cross, and here's this psalmist who describes himself as being in agony, and his bones are protruding, and he's a big mess, and yet he's praising God. But how do you do that when you have all these terrible things happening? So I'm going to tell the story of my friend. She suffered from lymphedema for a number of years. Her legs uh, just became dead weight, and it was just a big mess, and she struggled for years to stay mobile. But finally, from about last June, she could no longer be mobile. And so she ended up in a skilled nursing facility, and she just passed away in January. But we we sort of praised God for that. Even though we miss her and we're sad, we're grateful that she's no longer in pain. Her husband described her death as a blessed release. So sometimes death it's a relief, and sometimes we can praise God for even death. And in Jesus's death and resurrection, he was once he died, he was released from that pain, and then he was resurrected, and he was released from that body into a new body. So even death can be something to praise God over. Not always, And the other thing, the big theme is that God is with us in everything. Yeah. I'm going to stress this very hard, that God is with us in everything, but that God does not cause our distress. God does not cause our distress. And meanwhile, my friend was very inspirational, even through this whole thing when she was struggling to walk, and that she still had ministry. She visited our homebound folks. She and I did that together. She would send cards when people were sick. She would call people, and she volunteered at a food cupboard. All through that, up until, I don't know, maybe a year ago, she volunteered for them. And they found a way for her to have a place with them. They found a job for her where she didn't have to move. And she was such a bright spirit, always positive, and always looking for the possibilities in things. When I was feeling like, she would say, well, what about this? Why don't you try that? And sometimes they'd be like, oh, come on. But that's just how she was. She was a very bright spirit. And I know it wasn't easy for her. It had to be so difficult and frustrating. And I know she was in pain. But she never showed that with me. She was just a bright spirit, lovely person. And we're certainly not happy she's gone, but at the same time, it was a blessed release.
Right.
So that's what I'm going to be talking about on Sunday. There's my story.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. And you did wonderfully being, I put you on the spot with that, and you kind of did a test run, with it as well too. So no, that was beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having this discussion with me. I appreciate you asking me.